One of my favorite quotes from Margaret Thatcher is she said the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. So, these socialist policies that governments throughout the world have been following, they have to go in a different tact. They have to go back to, 19th century and 18th century America, which, created all of the wealth in America, which was basically limited government, let people get on with their lives, very, very low, if any, tax burden, so that the productive sectors of the economy can produce, and the middle class can save and work and produce and enjoy the fruits of their efforts, not have it taxed away by some government. The backbone of capitalism is really the middle class, and it's the middle class that's been getting screwed by governments around the world by these huge bailouts and the tax burdens that are being placed on the backs of the middle class.
Well, and these central banks, sir, people are finally waking up to the fact that, this system is a beastly system. This is not a system that supports the common man. This is not a system that's honorable. This is not a system that's built on liberty and justice any longer, especially in this country that I love. We really care about this country, and we're trying to sound the alarm to wake up our, brothers and sisters and say, look, this isn't going to get better. This is going to get worse before it gets better. So I guess my question for you, James, is when the government, which is supposed to represent us, is so off the tracks in terms of common sense on both the federal and, in many cases, the state level, and I'll cite the recent Indiana State Supreme Court ruling, which nullified the Fourth Amendment in that state as one good example, how do you explain the populace still being so indifferent and pacified and clueless when it comes to these critical life-changing issues we've been discussing?
That's a really good question. I'm not really a social scientist. I'm not a politician. I am an observer, and what I've observed is the fact that 58% of the American public gets a check from the government in some extent. 43 million Americans are getting food stamps from the government. So I think to a large extent there's a tremendous effort not to shake the boat in the hope that maybe they'll continue to get these government benefits in the future. But it ignores the reality that the federal government is, for all practical purposes, broke. And whether it happens next month, next year, or in 5 years, that reality of not having any money is going to come home. And there are only two things that can happen. The U.S. government defaults on its debt by not repaying it, or they default on its debt by destroying the currency. And the history of money has always been that when the government has the power to create money out of thin air, which the U.S. government has had the power since creating unconstitutional money in 1971 by going off the gold standard, it can create money out of thin air and therefore destroy the dollar. And that's essentially what Mr. Bernanke is doing at the Federal Reserve. That's why inflation is starting to get worse. He calls it quantitative easing, which is a fancy name, but really it's just money printing. And printing too much money is ultimately the destroyer of currencies.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up, because that was one of my next questions, quantitative easing. Jim Rickards is saying that there will not be a QE3. He's saying that there's enough Fed assets on the balance sheet to sort of continue to grease the wheel and take care of the bond market in the meantime. But isn't that all smoke and mirrors? Is there really any way that the Federal Reserve could get away with not doing QE3? Won't the system collapse without a QE3?
Yeah, that's the way I see it. When they started QE2 in August to the present, the U.S. government's debt has risen about $750 billion. Approximately $500 billion of that was purchased by the Federal Reserve. Now, the U.S. government's planning to spend even more money in the future, and the only way that they can get that money is either people lend it to them or they run the printing press. Now, we've already seen with QE2 that of that $750 billion, there's $500 billion that is coming from the printing press rather than from people who are willing to lend to the federal government. And given the unwillingness of the federal government to cut spending in the future, one can only assume that the Federal Reserve is going to continue their program of quantitative easing until the dollar is ultimately destroyed. But here's the important point, Sean. Nobody really knows the future, and that's where gold and silver come in. They're a form of protection until the future becomes clear, until a lot of the uncertainty is gone. until we get back on a sound monetary road. You can hold that gold and silver as a form of protection. And it's a way of dealing with the uncertain financial climate and an uncertain future.
Let me ask you about hyperinflation, which you've said is now a sure thing. In fact, I think you've said the chances are now 100% that we will see hyperinflation in the United States. How do we help people understand how important it is to get your arms around what that means?
Yeah, first of all, let's explain why hyperinflation occurs. And I've already started the explanation by talking about quantitative easing. When a government is spending more money than people are willing to lend to it, when the government is borrowing, the government has to either cut back on its spending or turn to the central bank to get that money created out of thin air, which the government gets, and then the government then spends. And that's what's happening in the U.S. now. So we're on this road to what I call hyperinflation, or this road to what history has shown is what I call the fiat currency graveyard. And if we don't get off this road, the dollar is going to end up in that graveyard by hyperinflation. And what we have to do is to go back to our constitutional principles. That's why Article 1, Section 8 and 10 talk about gold and silver being the currency of the United States. The first currency of America was the Continental. That was the currency during the War of Independence and the years after. And it was issued to excess. Too much of it was issued, and the Continental collapsed. So one of the reasons why the framers created a more perfect union was to create a common market and a common currency, which was the silver dollar. And so it was, for basically up until 1971. Now, we abandoned the wisdom of the framers by going off the gold standard, and as a consequence of abandoning the wisdom of the framers, we're relearning the same lessons they learned with the Continental, which collapsed. And so my concerns are the dollar is going to collapse just like the Continental if we continue doing the same thing that the framers of the Constitution did after the War of Independence. So, that's the situation we're in. And with the debt limit now, it looks like they're just kicking the can down the road. They want to increase the debt $2 trillion to take it from August 2nd until the November 2012 election. That's $2 trillion in 15 months it's going to be spent. And basically, they're saying they don't have the political will to solve the problem now. And if they don't have the political will to solve the problem now, who's to say they're going to have the political will to solve the problem in November 2012? I don't think they will. So, kicking the can down the road is not the answer. We need answers now, and the only logical answer is to read the Constitution, go back to the monetary system created by the framers, which is based on gold and silver. And a lot of these problems and excesses are going to solve themselves if we get off the backs of people and allow the free market, to cleanse the system that's been created. It's going to be tough, but the longer you push the problem down the road, the bigger it's going to become.
And for those of us in a helicopter that can see this road and have the 30,000-foot view about these issues, sir, we can see where that road ends. And they can kick the can down the road, but unfortunately the end of the road is a cliff, and they're running out of road.
One other thing about the end of the road, there are two things that happen after a currency collapse. And you can look at this, based on experiences around the world. After the currency collapsed with the Continental, we went the right way. We went back to the rule of law. We understood what the problem was. We created gold and silver as the basis of a new currency system. But in Germany, after the collapse of the Reichsmark in the 1920s, they went the bad way. They went to more authoritarian control, more fascism, and look where that happened. And monetary experience shows that, you don't always go the right way. Sometimes you go the bad way, and that should be worrying as well.
It should. For those of us who are informed, though, we're going to look to men like Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and hopefully the Americans that I accuse of being in a hypnotic state will wake up at that point. And it might take a currency collapse for those folks to wake up. So, Mr. Turk, for folks who are saying, well, the Fed can put an end to this thing quick and save the dollar by raising interest rates, and they have a plan. In my microdoc, The Madness of a Law Society 2, you noted, and I quote from that microdoc, as interest rates rise, the interest expense goes up, causing a bigger deficit, causing the government to borrow more, causing the Federal Reserve to do additional quantitative easing, further debasing the dollar, and ultimately meaning higher gold and silver prices. So they're really trapped here at these low 0% interest rates, aren't they?
Yeah, they really are. They have to do what the Congress did after the Civil War. You have to create a 10-year plan to go back to sound money. It's not going to happen overnight, but you need a plan and you need to start right away. But let me end on an optimistic note, Sean, because what we're seeing happening at the state level is, I think, what's necessary. You know, the states have to go back to the federal system that was created by the framers. And one of the important things that we're seeing at the state level is the concern about the problems with the Federal Reserve note, the dollar as it presently stands, and the desire to create an alternative currency which can be used within states should the U.S. dollar collapse. So Utah has recently passed some legislation. We've seen that legislation now being reviewed in South Carolina. Years ago, I was involved with the initial effort in New Hampshire, for sound money legislation. We've seen it in Nevada, I think Indiana, Montana, and a few other places as well, maybe even Minnesota. I'm not sure if that's on the list. But what we have to do is at the state level recognize the importance of being able to use gold and silver once again as a form of money and currency. And the fact that so many states are doing that, I'm very encouraged by that result.
Absolutely. We're all excited to see that legislation passed in Utah. Hey, before I let you go, I want to ask your advice. What advice would you give to those of us who are sounding the alarm but finding many deaf ears among both friends and family when it comes to these important issues?
Yeah, the only thing you can really do is make sure that you and your immediate family who share your concerns are protected. And the best way to do that, obviously, is to have tangible assets, have gold and silver, and provide everybody else with educational material and let them make the decision for themselves as to whether they share your concern or not. But just like people in Katrina in Louisiana, some were prepared for Katrina and some were not. The ones who relied on the government, ultimately ended up suffering very, very badly. The ones who were prepared for Katrina, they did okay. I mean, it was a tough time, but they were able to get through. We've got a financial Katrina coming, and we have to be prepared for it. And if you are prepared for it, it's going to be tough, but you're going to be able to get through the other side.
Well, thank you for your time, sir. And I want to just ask you in parting, to get involved in gold money for folks who are listening that might want to start to buy some silver and have it stored in your secure vaults, how does that work, and what is the minimum required investment to get started?
Yeah, there is no minimum. There is no maximum. You can go to goldmoney.com, open up a holding for free, and just see how it looks and how it works, and then make a decision as to whether you might want to try it. Choose which vault you want to store your precious metals that you purchase. And if you feel comfortable with it and like it, then just use it as one of your vehicles for accumulating, saving precious metals. Well,
Mr. Turk, James Turk of Gold Money, we thank you so much for your time. And guys, I'm going to put a link to Mr. Turk's YouTube channel, which is Gold Money News. Absolutely check it out and subscribe. He just put up some more videos. I think there's an interview here with Bill Murphy. Just some fantastic information on Gold Money News on YouTube. And James Turk, thanks so much for your time. We couldn't be more appreciative.
Thanks, Sean. Let's do it again at some time in the future.
Thank you. I look forward to it, sir. Okay. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's it, guys. Thanks again for tuning in, and be sure to check out sgtreport.com, where we cover a lot of ground on a daily basis. Until next time, thanks for watching.